Well, let's start our discussion of vertical jigging plastics with probably the most common and most widely used, especially if you live here in the Great Lakes area, and that is a worm. Just a simple 3.5 to 5 inch plastic worm. That's all that this is. It is a very, very common shape right now. If you're like me, you started jigging on the Detroit River or the Saginaw River, you knew about the Wyandotte worm, a very short, very thin piece of plastic that catches a lot of walleye, and worms should be something you have in your vertical jigging arsenal. Now, they are skinny, and I would suggest that you carry them from about 4.5 to 3 inches long. I like a worm, like our thumb worm that we've actually designed to be a little bit longer, but you pinch it off at the sex collar and it fishes a little bit shorter. So you've got the ability to fish multiple different lengths. If you have a short worm, you can't really extend it. So having a longer worm, being able to make it shorter is a great advantage. So buy a little bit longer worms and have the ability to make them a little bit shorter. Now, worms imitate a lot of bait fish and a lot of bait species that live in the bottom of the river. They're a great imitator of log perch, which are long and skinny bait fish. They're a great imitator of silver lampreys, an indigenous eel that lives here in the Great Lakes area that actually swims up the Detroit River to spawn. They're about 3 to 5 inches long, and they are very, very dark in color. We have a time frame where they're in the river and walleyes gorge themselves on them. Worms are great imitators. Worms are also great imitators of leeches that live on the bottom of the river and any other long, skinny bait fish. Even small shiners, these worms are going to imitate. So make sure you've got some in your boat. Make sure you've got worms that are 3 to about 4.5 to 5 inches long. They're thin, they're skinny, but they catch a lot of fish in the right conditions. Should definitely be something that you have in your boat every time you're vertical jigging. The number one vertical jigging plastic you need, make sure you have some worms. All right, now the next shape I want to talk to you about is one of my favorites, and it's called a jerk shad. We're kind of moving up the ladder here, getting a little bit thicker, a little bit bigger each time we go, and you'll understand that a little bit later when we talk about fall rate. But this is a jerk shad. It has a little bit wider back, has a little bit thicker belly, so it's kind of designed to look more like a minnow, but it's an absolutely fantastic shape. One of my favorites on the Detroit River. I would tell you more days than not, this is a shape that I personally start with. We'll have somebody in the boat with each of the shapes we're going to show you, but this is one of my favorites because it imitates a lot of different bait fish. Now, you can get it a couple different ways. We use them from Big Bite, and they've actually got a little slot in. These are actually designed to be fished like weedless jerk baits for bass. They're a little bit smaller, about 4 inches long. So they have a little slot and they have a hollow belly. You can also get these that are solid, right? Every manufacturer makes something like this. It's called a jerk shad. The big thing I want you to make sure of, though, if you're going to fish a jerk shad, is when you get past the belly, this plastic back here at the back end is very soft and very subtle. It actually moves and has some action. That's very important and one of the things that makes a jerk shad effective, right? So jerk shad, something you should have in your boat. Make sure you've got them. Make sure you fish them this year. I promise you they're going to be a great addition to your vertical jigging plastic box and going to catch you a lot of fish. Well, the next shape I want to talk to you about is, again, one of those that's well known, especially around our part of the world, and it is called a finesse minnow. We call it a slim minnow in the product that we sell, but traditionally it's going to be called a finesse minnow. That's kind of what everybody knows about. Everybody knows the Lunker City finesse, so that's what we're going to call it. Now, this is a little different than the jerk shad, the one we just talked about. It's a little bit thicker, has a much more streamlined shape, looks more like a traditional minnow, looks more like a shiner, looks more like a big log perch, looks more like a small goby. It has more of a minnow feel to it. The biggest difference between the finesse and the jerk shad is the plastics that is used. So the jerk shad is very soft and has a lot of action to it. Finesse minnows have a tendency to be a little bit stiffer and not have quite as much action. That's okay. There are times that these finesse minnows are going to catch a lot of fish. But again, a great imitator of minnows. I carry two sizes. This is the 3.5. I think they call this a 3.5. Might call it a 4-inch, but that's the standard everyday Detroit River size. I also carry it in a 5-inch because there are some times that we will get some smelt, we'll get some big shad in the river, and I like to imitate that bigger bait. So I do carry a bigger 5-inch version of this and a few key colors that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's the next step up, okay? A little bit thicker, More streamlined of a minnow shape than the jerk shad, doesn't have the big belly, but a great walleye catcher anytime you're dealing with walleyes in current. You want to make sure you've got some finesse minnows, or slim minnows as we call them here. They're a great addition to your tackle box. It's something you should be fishing every day to catch more walleyes. This next shape is one of my favorites, and it's called a disc worm. You'll hear it called a disc worm. That's what we call it. You'll hear it called a rib worm or maybe a ribbon worm. And it is basically just a long plastic worm. Let me see if we can get it there. There you go. Long plastic worm. It's got a couple features to it. It's got a bigger head. It's got more of a ball on the head. And on the side of the body is made up of ribs or circles that go around the body. That's going to be very important here in just a second. It also has a twister tail, okay? Which means it's going to fall a little bit slower and we're going to get a little more action, a little more sound, a little more vibration from it. But this is an important plastic to have in your Detroit River or anywhere you're vertical jigging. This is an important plastic to have in your arsenal because it does a couple things. First thing it does is it falls very slow. We're going to talk about fall rate in just a second. The other thing it does, because of the shape, it imitates big-headed bait that lives on the bottom of the river. I'm talking about sculpins. I'm talking about gobies. I'm talking about log perch. I'm talking about small crayfish. This is a great imitator of those types of prey that our other plastic body shapes don't imitate. It's an important piece to have. Again, one of those things I don't think most people have. If I look in most anglers' boat, they have worms and they have finesse minnows. You're missing some important steps, folks. That jerk shad is one of these, and absolutely without question, a disc worm is something you want to make sure you have in your boat. Now, here's why I think that's important. I'm going to tell you this about disc worms, and hopefully you'll make sure you get a few in your boat. I catch about 60 to 70% of my fish over 30 inches. My big fish every year I catch on the river, I catch about 3/4 of them on a disc worm. It is a great worm, a great plastic body to have if you want to catch bigger fish. There's just something about it that has a tendency to attract bigger fish. So I hope that excites you enough to add some of these disc worms into your selection and make sure you've got them on the boat and make sure you fish them. Get some disc worms, add them to your arsenal. I promise you, you're not going to be disappointed. All right, the last plastic shape I'm going to talk about is what I call swim baits, right, or paddle tail baits. Almost all these baits that I use have a boot tail, that big giant tail that makes a lot of vibration, that little boot tail right there. That's an important piece of this. So, small bass style swim baits, 3.5, 4.5, 5 inches long. Like this is a cane thumper by Big Bite, one of my favorites. Big bulky piece of plastic. Don't hit the river without having some of these old style Mr. Twister shad bodies. These are an amazing piece of plastic that catches a ton of fish on the river. But we want something bigger. We want some bigger, bulkier bodies. Again, I'm going to classify them all as swim bait style bodies. We want these for a couple reasons. Again, big walleyes, when they get shallow and they're feeding, they're not eating sometimes when they go up pre-spawn, spawn, and just after post-spawn, but they will get mad enough to bite something or strike something to get it out of the way. That's where these big baits come in handy. Big baits also work in really shallow water. They're also fantastic if the water gets a little bit dirty. Bigger profile, a little more sound, easier for the fish to see, an important thing to have. I don't think, if you want to kind of talk to me about plastics, I don't think enough anglers fish big enough baits often enough. I think that's an important part of this puzzle, is make sure you've got some bigger baits. Some paddle tail style shads, some bass style swim baits, maybe even some hand poured bass style swim baits that are a little bit bigger, thicker, and heavier. You want to make sure you've got some big, bulky, heavy plastics for certain conditions in the river. Dirty water, targeting big fish, fishing shallow water, and fishing really, really heavy cover on the bottom where it's hard to keep a jig from snagging. Bigger baits are going to help you catch more fish in those situations. Add some swim baits, talk to your bass fishing friends, maybe raid their tackle box a little bit, grab a couple swim baits this year. I promise you they're going to catch you a lot of fish. Why is it important to have all these different plastics, right? From a worm to a jerk shad, right? And then we kind of pop up to a finesse minnow, then we have a disc worm, and then we have these bigger, bulkier worms. Why is that important? What does that mean to us? And why should, when we start our day, why should we have multiple different shapes on instead of one lure in the same color? Well, here's why. Each one of these you can see, right? So if I hold up a worm and I hold up a disc worm, you can see that the disc worm is much bulkier. It's got the ribs or the disc on the body. It's got the twister tail. It is much bulkier and much less water hydrodynamic than this worm is. So what does that mean? We're going to talk about something called fall rate. How fast does your bait get back to the bottom? Now, the original fall rate is going to be determined by our jig size. If you know anything about me, you know that I like to fish big jigs. There's lots of advantages to fishing big jigs. We've already covered that lots of different times. But I can change how fast this jig gets back to the bottom simply by changing the piece of plastic I put on it. Again, that's called the fall rate. So if I take a really, really thin piece of plastic like this worm, it's going to fall very fast. So regardless of what jig head I put it on, it's going to make that jig head fall down to the bottom extremely quick, right? Not a lot of resistance here, very hydrodynamic, just kind of slides through the water, falls very quick. Conversely, if I grab a big hunk of plastic like this boot tail cane thumper, this big swim bait, it's going to fall very slow because it's heavier, it's thicker, it catches some water, and it slows down the fall rate. Each one of those baits I showed you, from the worm to the jerk shad, finesse minnow, disc worm, swim bait, they all have a different fall rate. And I will tell you this, being a pretty good record keeper, if you get the fall rate right every day, you can get the color wrong and still have a great fishing day. If you get the color right, but you miss the fall rate, you're fishing the wrong body shape, you're going to catch a lot less fish. So it's important in the morning, you start out with however many people you have in the boat, that's the minimum number of different shapes you have. You got somebody that's fishing 2 rods, they should always fish the same shape on both rods so they fall the same and there's no one falling fast, one falling slow. But everybody in the boat should be fishing a different shape in the morning. Once you get the shape figured out, the fall rate piece of this puzzle, then you can start dialing in on the color. Pay attention to that first. Understanding the skinnier and thinner a worm is, the faster it's going to fall to the bottom, and the thicker or the more ribs and twister tails and things it has on it, the slower it's going to fall. Fall rate is a key factor in getting the right plastic every time you're on the water. Pay attention to it before the color. I promise you, you're going to get dialed into a pattern a lot quicker and catch a lot more fish. Now, a sister to fall rate is what we call fall angle, because as a jig, let me go ahead and rig up a jig head here. As a jig falls slower, it spends more time in the water column, correct? Which means the longer it spends in the water column, the longer it takes that jig to get back to the bottom, the slower the fall rate, the more the current is catching it. So even with a hydrodynamically designed jig head like our thumb jig, you're still going to get a little bit of what we call fall angle. So if I take a worm, this really thin worm, and I jig it, and it's going up and down, it's going up and down very quickly, it's probably going to drop or have a straight fall angle. It's going to fall straight down. If I take something like this disc worm and put it on here, now I've got these ribs, these discs, a thicker piece of plastic, and a twister tail, it falls slower. So as it falls slower, instead of going straight up and down like our worm is, it has a tendency to fall at an angle that actually drops it back to the fish a little bit. It actually gets pushed downstream. So a worm is going to go straight up and down. These bigger, bulkier plastics are going to fall and kind of slide downstream as they fall. Obviously, a big piece of plastic like this boot tail is going to have a different fall angle. It's going to fall back downstream a little bit more. Now, what that does is 2 things. It changes the way the bait acts in the water, and it changes the way the fish actually are getting attacked by the bait. A lot of times fish will sit. We saw this on forward-facing sonar. A lot of times fish will just sit, and they'll see a jig come at them, and they'll just kind of slide out of the way. What happens when you go down and you slow down your fall rate, which gives you a downstream fall angle, is a lot of times as that bait falls, they can't move out of the way because the bait's coming at them. Not a lot, it's not a very aggressive, but it's definitely a difference in fall angle. So that fall rate and that fall angle all come together based on the shape that you pick. That's why it's important every morning you start with different shapes. Figure that out first and then dial in the color. Pay attention to the fall angle. Hey, if you don't believe me, stop in some shallow water this fall or this spring, slide downriver, pick up your jig, and watch how these different bodies act on the same jig head with the same jig stroke. Watch how they act differently. Imagine if you're a fish on the bottom and you're feeding on something that moves a certain way, and now here comes something that doesn't move that way. you're probably not going to be as inclined to eat it as if a piece of plastic comes by that looks right, falls right, and acts right when it's on the bottom of the river. That's where fall rate and fall angle come in. Pay attention to those two things, get them right, then you can dial in your color. You're going to catch a lot more fish, be a lot more effective. Pay attention this year. Keep some good records. Pay attention to what body styles are catching fish at different times. I promise you're going to see a pattern emerge. You're going to get keyed in on getting the right fall rate and the right fall angle before you get the color right. Well, obviously we just spent a little bit of time talking about different shapes, fall rate, fall angle, all those things. And I told you that both of those are more important than color, and they are. But once we get them dialed in, it's time to start talking about color. Now, I'm going to make color pretty simple. The way that I think about color is this. Everything that lives on the bottom of the river, especially on the bottom, if I'm jigging and I'm constantly in contact with the bottom, everything that lives down in that bottom part of the river, that bottom 6, 8, 10 inches, is dark. There is nothing down there that's white with blue, yellow, and red dots. Nothing. Everything that lives down there is dark. I like browns. I like blacks. I like purples. I like green pumpkins. I like watermelons. We have a color custom made for us that's called camo, one of my favorites. I like dark colors when I'm jigging on the bottom. Now, if I'm catching fish as I'm jigging and I go to drop my jig and I get a lot of bites on the way down, or I'm getting jigs at the top of my lift, that tells me that walleyes aren't necessarily feeding on bottom bait fish. They're actually feeding on minnows that are close to the bottom. So I'm going to change to a shape that imitates a free swimming minnow better, and I'm going to add some more, still subtle colors, not bright colors, but I'm going to add some more silvers. Some more bones, if you will, some things that look like a shiner or look like a shad, a little more. This is one of my favorite. This is called blueback herring. It's got a little bit of gray. Looks more like a free swimming minnow. I'm going to start to work on those colors as I start to dial in where the fish are. If I'm catching fish and my jig's up off the bottom, 8, 10, 12 inches, and I'm hovering it and just sliding downstream with it, I'm definitely going to go to a minnow imitator, something that looks, again, like a shad or a shiner, something that has a little more silver in it, a little more gray, a little more white, actually looks like one of those free swimming minnows, okay? Now, water gets a little bit dirty, which happens a lot on the rivers that we fish in the Great Lakes area. Water gets a little bit dirty. Or I've got fish that aren't biting. They're not feeding, but I can trigger them to strike. I can get them mad. I've got fish that are tightly grouped in an area. I've got fish that are spread out over flats. I've got big fish that are up shallow. That's when I may go to some really, really bright colors. I'm not against bright chartreuse, bright green, bright orange. This is something we call parrot. I'm not against those bright colors in the right situation. Dark water, fish that aren't actively feeding, but you can get them to strike, or fish that are shallow, aggressive, and chasing. Sometimes brighter colors can make a difference. So pick your colors, have a good assortment of colors, but really lean towards the darkers, the browns, the greens, the purples, the blacks, the watermelons, the camos, those types of colors. Have a few that imitate some minnows, then have a couple different colors that are very bright for those times that fish just want to be triggered or the water gets a little bit dirty. That's going to help you catch some fish. So color is important, but it's not important until you get the right shape. When you get the right shape with the right fall angle and the fall rate, that's going to be your number one thing you want to figure out. Then we can play with the color. All right? So there's some tips on color to help you. Look at, you don't need the same body shape in 75 different colors. You need 6 or 7 body shapes in 5 or 6 colors. You're going to catch a lot more fish. So color is important, but it's not important until. Carry the right colors, imitate the kind of colors that the fish are eating. I promise you, most days you're going to catch more fish. Well, there's everything that 30 years of vertical jigging for walleye has taught me about vertical jigging plastics, right? Understand again that the shape is the most important thing. That shape is going to determine what bait fish it most imitates, what fall rates you're going to have, and what fall angle the bait's going to have when it goes back to the bottom. Those 3 things are much more important than the color. Start out the morning, make sure everybody's got a different body shape on. That's going to get the right fall rate or the right shape dialed in. Then you can start making adjustments with the color after you figure out that fall rate. Hey, fishing with plastics, vertical jigging with plastics is a very efficient way to catch a lot of fish. You need some varied plastics, but be careful. Again, you're better to have more shapes in less colors than you are to have one or two shapes in a lot of colors. Concentrate on getting all the pieces right. The size, the shape, the action, the fall rate, and the fall angle. Get those right, then dial in the color. I promise you're gonna catch more fish. Hey, thanks for joining us here and have a great vertical jigging season on the river. Can't wait to see you out there.